Hello friends, I'm Daisy Victoria, and today I'm going to be making a 15th century hat known as a Hennin. This is the second part of making my Elizabeth Woodville costume. In case you missed the first part in which I created the dress and jewelry, I will link that below for you. A Hennin is this really interesting hat that was popular during the 15th century, especially in Burgundy and the Netherlands. A Hennin is actually the historical version of that pointy princess hat that we sometimes see in fairy tales. The type of Hennin I will be making is actually a truncated Hennin or a flower pot Hennin, thus named because it looks like a flower pot in shape. We have not found any extant Hennin, so it's kind of up to conjecture and extrapolation on how to make this type of hat. One theory, which I have tried in the past, is to make it using sort of a millinery technique. For that style, I actually used buckram, which is like a stiffened canvas fabric, and wire to create the structure. This time, I wanted to try a different method because, hey, why not try something new, right? Another theory on how this hat may have been made is actually using woven straw. I wanted to try this out. Now, because I'm a lazy costumer, or perhaps because I know my specialties and I wanted to focus on those, I decided not to weave the structure of the hat this time, but rather to use a basket so that I could quickly test the theory without actually going through the learning to weave a straw hat. I found this basket at my local craft store and it was perfect. I did try it on in the store, in case you are wondering. Now first I'm going to need to remove the handle from the basket because I don't need that on my head. And then I need to cover it with felt. So in period, they would have had wool felt available. I am using the very standard modern felt that you can find at any store, any craft store, because no one's going to see it anyway, so this will work out just fine. The felt is necessary because you want to smooth out that basket structure so that you don't have that poking through as the shape of your hat. I did this by mostly draping. I had kind of an idea of how big I wanted it to be first, and then I just started cutting my fabric and making it fit around. I made the inside piece smaller than the outside piece because you do have a little bit of a smaller distance to go around on the inside than you do around the outside. I did a lot of testing as I was creating these pieces because I was really just trying to drape it sort of around that hat, well, basket structure to make it fit just right. The circles that I used for the inside and the outside are actually perfect circles. I basically measured them and then made sure to cut them into circle shapes. I sewed that layer together that goes around the hat, and I did that off camera. It was just a really quick sew it together, and then I'm turning that right side out so that the seam is actually hidden on the inside, and I did do that by machine, and then make sure it fits on the hat. I did that for both the outside and the inside layers. Next, it was time to cut out the outer fabric. So this goes on top of the wool, and it's the part that looks all nice and pretty. And because I have a patterned brocade, I actually kind of played with it and made sure I got the part of the brocade that I wanted to show on the outside so I could feature a nice design. I'm only cutting one layer of this fabric because I don't need to put it on the inside of the hat. Having just the black wool, or actually I have black felt, see, I want it to be wool. Just having the black felt on the inside of the hat will be adequate, so this is only going on the outside of the hat. A note here that I did not already mention is that I cut my brocade using pinking shears, which are sort of jagged triangular shaped scissors, and they're really nice because they cut the fabric in a manner that you always get a bias on each cut, so it's much less likely to fray, or at the very least it will take a long time to start fraying. Once I had that cut out, it was time to make sure that the fit looked okay, just in case I needed to adjust anything. And here I am trying it on at this point. Looks good, looks like it fits all right, and that pattern of the brocade is where I want it. Now I've sewn the circle part onto the conical part that goes around the hat. Again, I did that off camera, but I think you can see how it looks. I sewed it right sides together so that way I could turn it, and then not that there's really right sides to felt, I suppose it's the same on both sides. But all of my seams are turned to the inside where you can't see them. I did the same thing with the brocade for the outer layer. So I sewed that conical portion together, right sides together. This time it does make a difference. And then I also sewed the circle part onto the bottom. Once I had all my layers sewn, I started putting them onto my hat. So I've got my felt layer in there and then my brocade layer on top. And then I've got another felt layer that goes on the inside of the hat. And I started using a lot of pins to put them into their position. Here I'm pinning everything into position. I just want to make sure that it all kind of stays where it's supposed to go. And then I'm folding over the inside with the brocade so that it kind of goes toward the inside of the hat, and then the inside lining layer is being folded over just at that edge there. So that means that the display of the hat is such that that brocade kind of shows over that edge, and then the lining is just on the very inside. This took a little bit of finagling because it is going around a curved edge, and with just a little bit of patience, it was not really too much of a problem. I sewed this down by hand. I do like to hide all of my machine stitches on historical garments, and I did hide my machine stitches on the dress, minus the hem at the bottom. And on the hat, I am also hiding all of my machine stitches. In fact, there are very few. Here is what the hat looks like after I sewed the edge down. Very nice. Next, it was time to make that funky little black loop that you see in the front of these hats in the period portraits. I created this using a bit of wire and some velveteen ribbon, which I already had, and I already did it off camera, so I'm just kind of showing you what I did. And also I used pinking shears to cut my organza. Here I'm creating this black band that we see them wear in the period images. This is made out of black velveteen. It's actually the same I used for my dress, so that was really convenient. And that little wire piece goes in the front center of that band. So what I'm doing here is turning it over, and I actually sewed most of it by machine, but I left that little part in the front open so that I could then stick the wire in there. Here I am turning it right side out. This was a rather thick velveteen, so not the easiest to turn right side out. And ultimately I ended up going to my little tin of pins here and finding a safety pin. And I used that for better success at turning it right side out. Once I turned that right side out, it was time to attach that little loopy thing. So I basically stuck that in there and made sure it was centered and looked nice. And then I hand stitched around it so that it stayed in place, making sure to catch the fabric, or the velveteen ribbon rather, which is covering that little loopy so that it stays in place. Next, I hand stitched the ends of my black headband closed, making sure to catch a piece of black velveteen ribbon on each side so that I may use that ribbon to tie it around the back of my head. Here you can see that the black velvet band is worn around the head and tied in the back as sort of a base for the hat, and then the hennin is set on top of that band. What I didn't mention, probably because I cut and shaped it off camera, is this wire that's sitting on the top of the hennin. Now, I chose to do this wire because it does look like Elizabeth is wearing a veil that's slightly further back than the edge of the hat, and there are other hennins from this period where there's a wire on top which holds the veil a little bit off of the hat. So I chose to do this in a manner that I thought would mimic the portrait of Elizabeth. I did this by taking a regular 14 gauge wire and bending it with pliers into a very elongated U shape, and then cutting it off at the end so that both sides were equal. Here you can see that I actually went ahead and curved the bottom of that elongated U wire down over the edge of the hat, and that just helps it to stay in place a little bit better, because as gravity would have it, it might want to fall or slide in a direction. But bending it over the front of the hat like that just gives it a little bit extra stability. Before actually hemming the veil and finishing it, I started pinning it onto the hat just to kind of play around and make sure that the size and everything was the way that I wanted it for functionality. While draping my veil, I took a lot of inspiration from Van der Weyden's portraits because he tended to paint very realistic and detailed sort of versions of these hats. So it helped me a lot. So thank you, Van der Weyden. You've helped me so much in my 15th century costuming endeavors, and once again, you saved the day here. It did take quite a lot of finagling and pinning to get the veil draped the way I wanted it, but always using those Van der Weyden images as well as these a little bit more nebulous image of Elizabeth Woodville as a guide, I was able to get it draped in a way that I like in the end. Next, it was time to finish off this veil. I used a poly organza, which I think has a really nice look that's similar to silk. In period, it should have been silk organza, but I was going for sort of a low budget version for this project. I did cut the edges with pinking shears so that they wouldn't fray while I was working with it. I hemmed this veil by hand because it's going to be very visible, so I don't want machine stitches here. I did this hem using a pretty simple turned over whip stitch, so nothing super fancy, just a little bit of time taken to actually sew it. I think it took me about 2 hours to do the hem for the entire veil, so not too bad, just a little bit of patience needed, that's all. And now it's time to pin everything onto the hat again, this time actually for its final placement. I'm pinning the veil down a little onto the forehead because that's the way it is seen in the portraits. In order to hold the veil in place, I'm actually using straight pins. In period, we do see a lot of straight pins used to hold veils in place. I selected some pins that have these little pearly white heads because I think they look a lot like some of the pins in the paintings. I actually have some more historically accurate pins which I use for my veils, but I wanted to leave these in the hat, so I just selected some low-cost pins I already had so I can go ahead and leave them in there. It was important for me to pin around both sides of the wire as well as in between, like in the center of that elongated U shape. So by doing that, I was able to get the veil to kind of stay in place better. I did actually pin the hennin onto the black band. That's very important so that it doesn't go anywhere or shift while wearing it. And I intend to actually leave these pins in so that I can go ahead and just put the whole structure on my head at one time, because I think that'll make getting dressed a lot easier. Another thing that helps this hat stay on the head is actually the hairstyle worn underneath it. In many similar images from the period, women are wearing their hair in braids that are wrapped over the top of their head. And I have found that wearing my hair in that style holds this hat and other similar hats on very well, because it provides sort of a shelf for the hat to sit on. And in fact, this black velvet band supports that, because if you put the black velvet band in front of those braids, it'll sit very nicely. And you can see me actually put it on along with the dress in my next video, which will be a get ready with me and photo shoot for my Elizabeth Woodville look. I really enjoyed making this entire costume, and I have to admit that this hennin was sort of a big selling point for me to create it. I love hennins. I've always been into those pointy princess hats, and I was into Burgundian court fashion before I knew what it was. And having made a couple of hennin styles before, I was really excited to try out this basket method so I could see how it works. And I think it provides a really nice, really stable hat structure, so I actually really like it. I also had never played with that little elongated U wire structure before, and in fact there is another hennin I would like to make that will require a similar wire structure, So it was really nice to use this Hennin as a time to play with it and see how it works. I hope you found this project inspirational, and if you decide to make your own 15th century Hennin or other hat inspired by what I've shared with you, please be sure to tag me and find me on social media. I'd love to see what you make. And don't forget to subscribe. I suppose that's something we are to remind you to do here. If you don't subscribe, still come back and look for my getting dressed video next time so you can see how I actually put this whole thing on. I hope you guys have a super awesome, magical day, and I will see you again very soon.